What do you do when a man who promised to build a future with you starts looking at someone else like you're just a wall he painted over? Hi, family. I beg you to please subscribe to my channel to keep me going. Posting daily can be tiring, but every time I see your subscription, your likes and comments, it keeps me going. So hit the subscribe button to help the channel. Thank you all. Now shall we continue? The morning of my wedding smelled like sawdust and rain, the kind of smell that used to mean fresh beginnings. I'd spent months designing every detail, not of the ceremony, but of the life I thought I was building with Jack Cloud. We were supposed to be proof that two broken people could make something whole. But as I stood in that old barn surrounded by white chairs and nervous laughter, I felt it, the crack in the foundation. And when she walked in, I finally understood why. The barn had been my idea. I wanted something simple, honest, untouched by luxury. No chandeliers, no grand piano humming in the background, just wooden beams and wildflowers gathered from the fields behind the property. The scent of damp earth mixed with peonies and sunlight filtered through open windows, scattering over faces I'd known for years. Jack stood near the altar, his hands folded behind him, gaze fixed on the floor like he was counting the distance between us. I told myself it was nerves. Every groom gets nervous. Every bride imagines the worst moments before the best. But then he looked up, and for a heartbeat, I saw hesitation flicker behind his smile. My stomach twisted, yet I smiled back, pretending not to see. Before that moment, before the silence that changed everything, there had been months of laughter, shared sketches, whispered dreams. Jack and I met on a job site 2 years earlier, back when I still believed healing could come from rebuilding walls. He was a carpenter with calloused hands and a quiet humor that could soften even the hardest mornings. I was a home renovation designer who believed that restoring broken spaces meant restoring people. We met over splinters and blueprints, and from that chaos, something gentle began. He used to tease me about my obsession with symmetry. "You want every wall to tell a story," he'd say, brushing sawdust off his shirt. "Maybe I just want things to make sense," I'd answer. And he'd smile, that small, uneven smile that made my chest flutter. We worked together on a series of projects, run-down homes, forgotten buildings. Jack would craft, I'd design, and somehow our teamwork always felt effortless. Late nights turned into early breakfasts, and somewhere between cups of burnt coffee and shared playlists, we stopped pretending we were just co-workers. The first time he kissed me, it wasn't fireworks or music. It was quiet, careful, the kind of kiss that felt like a promise whispered under breath. That night, I told Joyce, my best friend, over the phone. She laughed, her voice warm and teasing. "Finally, Sophie Wells let someone in. Should I plan the wedding now or later?" I'd roll my eyes. "It's not like that." But even then, part of me hoped it was. Jack wasn't flashy. He never tried to impress. He just showed up always. He built me a small wooden model of a dream home I once described half asleep. It was imperfect but heartfelt, just like him. I kept it on my nightstand, tracing the tiny roof whenever doubt crept in. Over time, his quiet became comfort, his steadiness a home I wanted to live in. When he proposed, it wasn't under fairy lights or with a crowd watching. We were standing in the middle of a half-finished kitchen, paint stains on our clothes, music playing softly from his phone. He handed me a ring that wasn't even in a box, just a delicate band he'd carved from a piece of cherry wood. "Let's build something that lasts," he said. My heart stuttered. I nodded, too moved to speak. Everything about that moment was raw, unpolished, real. I thought love was supposed to feel that way. But as the wedding day approached, his warmth began to cool. Little things, missed calls, long silences, distracted glances. I caught him staring at his phone once, eyes unfocused, thumb tracing the edge of a message he wouldn't open near me. When I asked, he said, "Work stuff." I wanted to believe him. I needed to. Love, after all, is built on trust, and I'd already built too much around him to start doubting. Still, one evening, while searching for a measuring tape in his workshop, I found a small music box hidden in the drawer of his workbench. It was half-carved, unfinished, with the name Angel etched delicately along the side. My heart skipped. When I confronted him gently, he laughed softly. "Someone I used to know. Not a big deal." I didn't press further, though his tone carried a weight that stayed with me. I told Joyce about it later, hoping she'd talk sense into me. Maybe you're overthinking, she said. Men keep old stuff. Doesn't mean they want it back. I nodded, pretending her logic worked. But something about that music box refused to leave my mind. The morning before the ceremony, I couldn't sleep. I walked through the barn, checking every flower, every light, every detail, convincing myself control could erase anxiety. Jack arrived hours later, carrying boxes of supplies, smiling like everything was fine. He kissed my forehead and whispered, "See you at the altar." His voice trembled. I chose to ignore it. The guests filled the seats, laughter echoing against the wooden walls. The air was thick with warmth and excitement. Joyce adjusted my veil, whispering, "You look breathtaking." I smiled because that's what brides do. The music began, slow and tender. My father walked me down the aisle, his grip steady. Jack looked up as I approached, his lips parting slightly as if he wanted to speak but couldn't find the words. I reached him, eyes shining with tears I didn't yet understand. The officiant began, words blending into the hum of my heartbeat. Jack's fingers brushed mine, but they were cold. When it was time for our vows, I spoke first, voice trembling but full of certainty. "You've taught me that love doesn't need perfection, just patience. That rebuilding isn't about covering cracks, but learning to live with them." He smiled faintly. Then it was his turn. He opened his mouth, but before sound escaped, the barn doors creaked open. Every head turned. A woman stood there, tall, poised, radiating the kind of calm that silences entire rooms. Her hair glimmered beneath the sun, and in her hands was a small wooden box. The same unfinished music box I'd found weeks ago. Jack's breath caught, his shoulders stiffening. The room pulsed with whispers. I watched him look at her, and everything inside me shattered quietly. His eyes weren't confused. They were alive, hopeful, familiar. The kind of look you give someone who once held your heart. I didn't move. Couldn't. My bouquet slipped from my fingers, petals scattering across the wooden floor like pieces of everything I believed in. The officiant hesitated. Joyce's hand found mine, trembling. Jack whispered her name under his breath. "Angel." That was when the truth hit. Not like thunder, more like the slow cracking of glass. I'd built my world around someone who had already given his heart away. The guests' murmurs blurred, faces melting into color. All I could hear was the hollow rhythm of my pulse. I looked at him one last time, the man who once promised forever, and all I could think was how beautifully cruel love could be, how it lets you build castles on foundations that were never yours. The next morning arrived without permission. The light that slipped through the curtains felt like an intrusion rather than comfort. Thin and sharp, as if it wanted to remind Sophie that the world hadn't paused with her heartbreak. She lay still in the bed that wasn't hers anymore, surrounded by silence that carried the faint scent of roses and burnt candle wax from the wedding that never was. Her phone buzzed endlessly somewhere on the dresser, full of apologies she didn't want to read. Every message would start the same way. "Are you okay?" And she wasn't. She didn't want to be. She just wanted stillness. But grief has its own impatience. It demands motion even when your heart refuses. She got up, hair tangled, dress still hanging by the mirror like a cruel joke, the white now too bright for her eyes. She grabbed her coat, keys, and nothing else, walking out before she could think twice. The town roads were empty at dawn. The barn stood behind her like a ghost that didn't know how to leave. She didn't look back. The drive out of town stretched endlessly, gray skies dissolving in a fog as she followed no map, no destination, just the desperate pull of distance. The car radio played a song she once loved, but now every lyric felt like salt. She shut it off and drove in silence, the kind that sits in your chest like unspoken words. Hours later, she stopped at a gas station somewhere off a forgotten highway. The smell of oil and cheap coffee clung to the air. Inside, an old man at the counter gave her a curious look, but she avoided his eyes, paying for fuel and a bottle of water without speaking. As she turned to leave, a flyer on the bulletin board caught her attention. "Help needed, community renovation project, Meadow Ridge Town. Volunteers welcome." The words felt like a lifeline thrown into storm water. Maybe she didn't need to know where she was going. Maybe she just needed somewhere broken enough to understand her. She tore the flyer down, folded it neatly, and drove toward the name. Meadow Ridge wasn't on most maps. A small, forgotten town tucked between fields and forests. It looked like a memory frozen in sepia. Houses leaned with age, fences sagged, and signs faded under the weight of time. Yet there was a strange warmth in the air, like the place hadn't given up on itself just yet. She found an inn called The Haven, the paint peeling from its wooden sign, but the garden out front stubbornly alive with wildflowers. The woman at the desk smiled kindly, her voice carrying the softness of someone who had seen too many lost travelers. "Room for one?" she asked. Sophie nodded, her throat dry. Just for a few nights. She didn't know if that was true. Inside, the room was small, plain, quiet. The kind of quiet that didn't accuse or echo, just existed. She sat on the edge of the bed, hands trembling without reason. Then, without thinking, she opened her bag and pulled out the wooden ring Jack had given her. It felt lighter than before, as if grief had hollowed it out. She placed it on the nightstand, turned it face down, and whispered, "That's the last time." She slept without dreams. The next day, she woke to the sound of hammering. Through the window, she saw a group of people working on an old building across the street. The sign read Community Restoration Center. They moved with energy, determination, like the world wasn't ending, like something could still be saved. Curiosity pulled her outside before she could stop herself. The man leading the team stood tall, with sawdust in his hair and paint smudged across his shirt. His movements were precise, patient. When he noticed her watching, he smiled, the kind of smile that didn't ask questions but offered ease. "You new around here," he said. His voice was calm, grounded. "I'm Robert Wells. You looking for a place to help or a place to hide?" She blinked, caught off guard. "Is there a difference?" He chuckled softly. "Depends on what you need." He handed her a pair of gloves and pointed toward a pile of broken boards. "We're rebuilding the community center. It's seen better days. You can start by clearing what's left of the old flooring." She hesitated, then took the gloves. Work was muscle memory, steady, simple, mindless. Each board she lifted carried a rhythm that kept her from thinking. The scrape of metal, the thud of discarded wood, it all made more sense than people ever did. Robert didn't hover, didn't pry. He just worked beside her, humming occasionally, speaking only when necessary. There was something refreshing about that silence shared between strangers. At noon, he offered her a sandwich and a bottle of water, sitting with her under the shade of a half-rebuilt awning. "You're good at this," he said between bites. "Most people quit after 10 minutes. Too much dust." She smiled faintly. "I've had worse." "City girl," he guessed. "Designer," she replied. "Home renovation." His brow lifted slightly. So you already know how to rebuild what's broken." The word stung, though his tone was kind. She swallowed and changed the subject. Over the next few days, she returned without intending to. Every morning, she'd wake before sunrise, drawn to the noise and motion of the project. The team welcomed her easily, grateful for extra hands. Robert became a constant presence, steady, patient, quietly observant. He asked about her ideas for redesigning the space, and for the first time in weeks, her mind clicked into focus. She sketched layouts, suggested color palettes, and directed light placements. The act of creation filled the emptiness like plaster over cracks. Yet even as she worked, she felt ghosts linger, the memory of Jack's laughter, his promises, his hands shaping with the same way Robert's did now. Sometimes she'd catch herself watching Robert's hands too long, then quickly look away. He noticed but never mentioned it. One afternoon, rain started suddenly, drenching everyone before they could move equipment inside. They huddled under the half-built roof, laughing as water splashed around them. Sophie stood at the edge, face tilted toward the gray sky, letting the cold drops blur everything. Robert handed her his jacket without a word. When she looked at him, there was no pity in his eyes, only quiet understanding. "You look like someone learning to breathe again," he said softly. She didn't answer, maybe because he was right. That night, Back at the inn, she sat by the window sketching plans for the new community hall. The design wasn't perfect, nothing ever was, but it was alive. The next morning, she found a note slipped under her door. "Coffee after work? R." She smiled despite herself, folding the note like something fragile. It wasn't romance. It wasn't even hope. It was acknowledgement that she was still here, still capable of existing beyond what had broken her. When evening came, she met him at the small cafe by the river. The place smelled like cinnamon and nostalgia. They talked about everything except their pasts: music, favorite cities, books they'd never finished. It felt easy, light. When she returned to her room later, she didn't cry for the first time in months. The silence no longer hurt. It held her gently, like a promise of something not yet defined but waiting. The weeks in Meadow Ridge began blending together like brushstrokes on an unfinished painting. Mornings came with the smell of fresh coffee and the sound of construction outside her window, each day carrying the steady hum of renewal. Sophie started to find rhythm again, measured breaths, focused steps, tasks that didn't leave space for heartbreak to echo. Work at the community center became her anchor, her hands constantly busy, smoothing, sanding, painting, mending. When she worked beside Robert, silence didn't ache, it healed. He talked about the town's history, how it used to be alive with festivals and music before most people moved away. His voice carried a warmth that softened even the sharp edges of memory. "Every wall has stories hidden in its cracks," he said one afternoon as they worked on the main hall. "The trick is learning which ones to keep." She smiled faintly, nodding, even though her heart still carried too many she wanted to forget. He had a way of speaking that never pried, yet somehow always reached her where words usually failed. There was something about his steadiness, his lack of pretense, his quiet confidence that felt safe. And safety was something she hadn't felt in a long time. When the sun dipped each evening, the town transformed. The horizon would blush orange, and laughter from nearby houses filled the air. Children raced down the dusty streets, chasing wooden toy cars, while old women sat on porches humming songs older than time. It was so different from the world Sophie had come from, one of deadlines, contracts, and glossy perfection. Here, imperfection was part of the charm. She started sketching again, not for clients, but for herself. Little drawings of restored windows, sunlit porches, quiet faces. She filled pages with homes that looked lived in rather than staged. Each line felt like reclaiming a piece of herself she didn't know she'd lost. One evening, as they packed up tools, Robert turned to her. "You ever think of staying here?" She froze for a moment, unsure if he was serious. "Meadow Ridge?" she asked. "You'd get bored in a week." He shrugged. "Maybe. Or maybe you'd find something worth not running from." His tone wasn't teasing. It was simple, matter of fact. It stayed with her long after he left that night. The next day, she was alone at the site, touching up a section of wall they'd plastered earlier. A box of old letters had been found behind a loose board, dated decades back. Most were from townsfolk, love notes, shopping lists, even a few apologies written in looping cursive. She read one that said, "Sometimes we rebuild not because we must, but because we're too stubborn to let something die." She folded it gently, smiling at how much truth fit into that single line. Later that afternoon, Robert joined her, handing her a cup of iced lemonade. "The heat's brutal today," he said, setting his tool bag down. "You're still here." "Couldn't stay away," she replied. He chuckled, leaning against the railing. They watched a group of kids painting signs for the upcoming town fair. One of them waved at Sophie, shouting, "Miss Wells, come see." She laughed, surprised at how easily the name rolled off their tongues, how normal it sounded here. When she walked over to the children, they showed her their art, bright swirls of color that didn't follow any rules. "It's supposed to look like the sun exploded," one little girl announced proudly. Sophie nodded. "It's perfect." For the first time, the word didn't feel like pressure. It felt like truth. That evening, Robert asked her to take a walk by the river. The sky had turned indigo, dotted with stars. The water shimmered faintly under the moonlight. They walked in comfortable quiet until he finally spoke. "I used to come here when things didn't make sense," he said. "My dad built half the town's houses. He used to say if you fix one roof a day, you'll never notice how broken the world really is. Sophie smiled softly. He sounds like someone who knew how to live. Robert nodded. He did, until he didn't. She didn't ask more. Grief recognized grief. It didn't need details. They sat by the water for a long time, watching reflections dance. I think I'm starting to understand why you came here, he said. Am I that transparent? No, he replied. Just human. She looked down, tracing circles in the sand with her shoe. I thought love was about finding someone who fits into your plans. Turns out, it's about learning how to rebuild when those plans collapse. Then you're already ahead of most people, he said quietly. The night breeze tugged at her hair, and for a moment, it didn't feel like loss anymore. It felt like a beginning disguised as healing. When she returned to her room later, she opened her sketchbook and drew the outline of a house by a river. She didn't know whose it was yet, but it felt peaceful. Days passed, and the project neared completion. The community hall now stood tall again, its walls bright, floors smooth, windows wide open to let light flood in. The grand reopening was planned for the weekend, and everyone in town was buzzing with excitement. Sophie helped hang garlands and fix lighting, but inside, her chest tightened with a mix of pride and sadness. She realized she'd rebuilt something beautiful, yet she wasn't sure she belonged to it. That night, Robert found her sitting on the steps outside the hall. You look like someone who's about to leave, he said. She looked at him, unsure how to respond. I haven't decided. He sat beside her. You don't have to. Sometimes the decision finds you. They sat in silence for a while before he added, I don't want to make this harder, but I need to say it. I'm glad you came here. The town's better with you in it. She exhaled slowly, eyes glistening. Thank you, Robert. It was all she could manage. The fair arrived 2 days later. The whole town gathered. Music, laughter, lights spilling from every corner. Children ran around with ribbons, old couples danced, and Sophie found herself smiling without trying. When Robert approached her under the string lights, holding 2 cups of cider, she accepted one, their fingers brushing briefly. The spark wasn't romantic. It was something purer, like 2 people recognizing that they'd both survived their own storms. As the night wound down, the mayor took the stage to thank everyone involved. When Sophie's name was mentioned, applause erupted. She blushed and used to being the center of attention. Robert leaned closer and whispered, Told you you belonged here. She laughed quietly, shaking her head. Later, as she walked back to the inn alone, the air cool and heavy with the scent of summer, she realized she hadn't thought about Jack all evening. The ache was still there somewhere, faint but distant, like an echo losing strength. She stopped by the bridge, overlooking the river, watching the ripples shimmer beneath the moon. For the first time, she didn't feel broken, just human. Tired, scarred, but still standing. Back in her room, she packed slowly, unsure if she'd stay or leave. She placed her old wooden ring on the windowsill, where moonlight touched it, and smiled. You were beautiful once, she whispered, but I'm done rebuilding what wasn't meant to last. Outside, the town slept quietly. The world didn't stop spinning. And for the first time in a long time, Sophie didn't wish it would. She turned off the light, let the darkness wrap around her gently, and drifted into the kind of sleep that comes only after surrender. Morning came with a quiet certainty, the kind that doesn't demand attention, but simply exists, steady and unshaken. The sunlight fell through the curtains like it belonged there, soft and forgiving. Sophie stirred awake, her mind clear for once. No dreams of Jack, no replayed memories, just the sound of the town waking, distant chatter, the creak of bicycle wheels, birds gossiping by the window. She sat up slowly, stretching, her body feeling lighter, as if she'd set down a burden in her sleep. Her sketchbook lay open beside her, the drawing of the riverside house from the night before staring back at her. She touched the lines with her fingertips, thinking how odd it was that something could look both unfinished and complete at the same time. Maybe that's what healing really was, not closure, but continuation. Downstairs, the inn's kitchen smelled of cinnamon and fresh bread. Mrs. Hargrove, the owner, waved as Sophie entered. You're up early, sweetheart, she said, sliding a cup of tea across the counter. Couldn't sleep too long, Sophie replied, smiling. You'll miss this place when you leave, Mrs. Hargrove teased, leaning on the counter. Sophie took a sip of her tea. You think so? I know so. This town grows on people like ivy. You'll try to shake it off, but it'll find a way back. The old woman chuckled before heading off to the storeroom, leaving Sophie with the lingering warmth of her words. By mid-morning, she walked to the community hall, now fully restored, glistening in the sunlight. The fair banners still hung across the streets, fluttering lazily in the breeze. People waved as she passed. She'd become part of the rhythm here, her presence woven into their days. When she arrived, Robert was already inside, fixing the final touches to one of the window frames. You're here early, he said without looking up. You too. Habit, he replied. Can't leave things half done. She smiled faintly. Neither can I. They worked side by side in quiet efficiency. There was no tension, no need to fill the air with chatter. Just mutual respect and the unspoken comfort of company. After a while, Robert straightened up, wiping his hands on a rag. So, he said casually, what happens now? She looked at him, caught off guard. What do you mean? You've fixed the town, helped half the people here find their spark again. What about you? Where do you go next? She hesitated. I don't know. Maybe back to the city. Maybe not. He nodded slowly, as if expecting that answer. You don't have to decide today. The door creaked open behind them. Sophie turned and froze. Standing in the doorway was Jack. He looked exactly as she remembered, too composed, too polished, wearing guilt like cologne. The sunlight framed him almost cruelly, making his presence impossible to ignore. For a second, the air seemed to disappear. Sophie, he said, voice low, hesitant. She blinked, trying to process if it was real or some cruel illusion. What are you doing here? Her tone was calm, almost cold. I've been looking for you, he said. You vanished. No calls, no messages. She let out a small, bitter laugh. You were busy planning a wedding, remember? Robert glanced between them, but said nothing. Jack stepped closer, his voice tightening. It wasn't what it looked like. It was exactly what it looked like, she interrupted. You chose her. Because I thought. He stopped, running a hand through his hair. I thought I was doing the right thing. My family, my career, they were all tied up in it. But it's over now. I ended it. Sophie crossed her arms, keeping her distance. And now you came to what? Collect what's left. He winced. No, I came because I realized none of it meant anything without you. The room was silent, except for the faint ticking of the old clock on the wall. Robert stepped back quietly, giving them space, but staying close enough if she needed grounding. Sophie took a deep breath. You think you could just show up, and everything rewinds? Her voice was steady now, the kind that carries quiet authority. I built something here, Jack. Not just walls and windows. Me. I rebuilt me. He looked at her, his eyes softening. I can see that. You look different. Stronger. I am, she said simply. And that's why I can finally say this. Thank you. His brows furrowed. For what? For breaking me, she replied. Because I wouldn't have found myself otherwise. Jack took a small step forward. Sophie, don't, she said firmly. Whatever you came to say, I don't need it. Her eyes flicked toward Robert briefly, then back to Jack. You taught me what I don't want. That's enough. He nodded slowly, defeated but somehow relieved. You deserve the world, Sophie. I already have mine, she said quietly. Jack left without another word, the door closing softly behind him. The sound echoed like the final note of a song that had played too long. Robert stood still, watching her. You okay? He asked finally. Sophie let out a long breath, a small smile curving her lips. I think so. For the first time in a long time, I think I am. The rest of the day passed in quiet reflection. The town carried on as usual. Children laughing, shop bells ringing, sunlight stretching lazily across rooftops. But inside her, something monumental had shifted. The ghosts that used to haunt her heart had lost their grip. That evening, she and Robert sat outside the hall again, the same steps where they'd once spoken about belonging. He handed her a cup of tea. So, he said lightly, you staying? She didn't answer right away. She looked at the horizon, at the river glinting in the distance. Maybe for a while, she finally said. I don't know what's next, but I'm not running anymore. He nodded. That's all that matters. The night stretched out around them, peaceful and unhurried. The stars began to bloom in the sky, one by one, like soft promises. Sophie leaned back, exhaling deeply. Funny thing, she said quietly. I thought love was supposed to be the point, but maybe it's just the lesson. Robert smiled faintly. Or maybe it's both. They sat in silence again, comfortable and warm, the kind that needed no words. In the distance, the faint hum of the river whispered through the night, steady and endless. Sophie closed her eyes and let it wash over her, feeling whole. Not because someone completed her, but because she finally stopped waiting for someone to. And for the first time since her life had fallen apart, she wasn't mourning what she'd lost. She was grateful for what she'd found. Peace, purpose, and a quiet kind of joy that came from simply choosing herself. The rain returned that weekend, soft and rhythmic, falling in silver threads that blurred the edges of Meadow Ridge. Sophie stood by her window, watching droplets race each other down the glass, the air smelling of wet earth and nostalgia. She used to hate the rain, back when it meant loneliness, back when every drop reminded her of waiting for someone who never showed up. But now it was different. It felt like renewal, like the world washing itself clean. She pressed her palm against the cool glass and smiled faintly. The sound was comforting, a quiet companion to her thoughts. The community center was done. The town was thriving again, and yet Sophie's heart still wandered somewhere between staying and leaving. She decided to go for a walk despite the drizzle. The streets glistened under the gray sky, puddles catching reflections of the old lampposts. Umbrellas bloomed like slow-moving flowers across the sidewalks. At the edge of the town square, she saw Robert helping an elderly man fix his bicycle chain, his shirt damp, his hair dripping from the rain. He looked up as she approached, a grin breaking through his soaked expression. You picked a great day for a stroll, he teased. Rain's my favorite, she replied, her voice light. Besides, I like watching everyone else rush for cover. You're strange, he said, laughing. That's the nicest thing anyone's said to me today. They ended up walking together toward the river, shoes splashing in shallow puddles. The world around them felt slower, quieter. The rain softened the town's usual noises into a steady hum. When they reached the bridge, Sophie stopped, leaning over the railing. You ever think about what keeps people in one place? She asked. Robert rested his elbows beside hers. Sometimes it's love. Sometimes it's guilt. Most times it's comfort. And you? Obligation, he said after a pause. This town was my father's dream. I couldn't just leave it behind. Do you ever want to? She asked. He smiled faintly. Maybe, but I think we all stay somewhere, waiting for something to change. The rain grew heavier. They ran for shelter under a nearby awning, laughing as water streamed down their faces. Her hair clung to her cheeks, and she wiped at it, still smiling. You're drenched, he said. You too. Yeah, but I'm used to it. He handed her his jacket, but she shook her head. I'm fine. He draped it over her shoulders anyway. Humor me. His tone was gentle, but it carried something deeper, something she didn't dare name yet. They waited there, watching the rain blur the world outside. After a while, Sophie spoke softly. You know, I used to think the worst thing in life was losing someone you love. But now I think it's losing yourself trying to keep them. Robert looked at her, eyes thoughtful. Then you've already done the hardest part, finding yourself again. Maybe, she murmured. But sometimes I still wonder what could have been different. That's human, he said. But maybe it's not about what could have been. Maybe it's about what is. When the rain finally stopped, the town glistened like glass. The streets shimmered, and everything smelled alive. They walked back slowly, their shoulders brushing now and then. By the time they reached the hall, the clouds had begun to break apart, streaks of gold cutting through the gray. Robert stopped at the entrance and turned to her. I was thinking, he began, there's a place on the hill, old farmhouse overlooking the town. Used to belong to my father's friend. Needs fixing, of course. Of course, she said, smiling. I figure we could restore it. Together. if you're still looking for something to build. She tilted her head, studying him. Is this your way of keeping me here? Maybe, he admitted, laughing. Is it working? She didn't answer right away. Instead, she looked up at the sky, the last drops of rain sliding off the eaves. I don't know where I belong anymore, she said quietly, but I know where I feel at peace. And, he asked. She smiled softly. It's here. They started the farmhouse project a week later. The place was half collapsed, but to Sophie, it looked like possibility. Dusty beams, cracked tiles, vines creeping through the windows. She loved it all. Together, they cleaned, patched, painted. It became a new rhythm. Mornings with sunlight streaming through broken shutters. Afternoons filled with laughter and old country songs playing from Robert's tiny radio. They shared lunches on the porch, watching clouds drift lazily across the horizon. Sometimes, she caught him watching her when he thought she wasn't looking, his gaze steady, curious, but patient. He never pushed, never asked for more than what she could give. That patience became its own kind of affection. One afternoon, as they sanded the floorboards, he said, You ever think maybe this place needed you as much as you needed it? She looked around, at the half-repaired walls and open windows. Maybe, she said, or maybe it's the other way around. As weeks passed, the farmhouse began to feel like home. Sophie filled its corners with her sketches, her tools, her laughter. There were no chandeliers, no marble floors, just wood, sunlight, and the smell of fresh paint. It wasn't luxury, it was life, and she realized that somewhere between heartbreak and healing, she'd stumbled into something real. Not love in the dramatic sense, but connection, trust, friendship, a quiet companionship that didn't demand, didn't pretend. One evening, they sat on the porch, the air thick with the scent of rain-soaked grass. Fireflies flickered across the field, tiny sparks of gold in the dark. Sophie leaned back, exhaling deeply. Do you ever think about the future? She asked. Sometimes, Robert said, but it changes every time I try to picture it. Mine too. And now, he asked, what do you see? She looked out at the darkening fields, the world settling into calm. I see light, she whispered, and peace. That's enough for me. He nodded, his eyes warm in the fading light. That's enough for me too. The night deepened, wrapping the house in silence. Sophie thought of how far she'd come, from the girl who once waited for love to rescue her, to the woman who now built her own safety, piece by piece. She wasn't sure where the road ahead led, but for the first time, she didn't need to know. She had her peace, her purpose, and the steady comfort of knowing she'd survived what was meant to destroy her. Somewhere in the quiet, Robert's voice broke through the stillness. I think this house has your name all over it. How so? She asked. Because it's stronger than it looks, he said softly. She smiled, eyes glistening as she whispered, then maybe it's finally home. And in that moment, with the night humming around them and the world quietly breathing again, Sophie realized she was exactly where she was meant to be. The first snow of the season came quietly, like a whisper that slipped into the cracks of the world. Meadow Ridge transformed under its touch, rooftops gleaming white, trees bowing under soft weight, and the air smelling sharp and new. Sophie stood on the porch of the farmhouse she and Robert had rebuilt, wrapped in an oversized sweater, a steaming mug in her hands. She watched as flakes landed on the railing and melted slowly, leaving tiny silver trails. It felt surreal, seeing the place so alive. The same walls that had once been broken now held warmth and laughter. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. Every creak of the floor, every uneven nail told a story. Her story. Robert came out with his jacket half zipped, his breath misting in the air. You're going to freeze out here, he said, stepping beside her. I've been through worse, she teased. Besides, I like the quiet. He leaned on the railing. You always say that when you're thinking too much. You read minds now? No, he said, smiling, just you. She rolled her eyes but smiled back. There was something grounding about his presence, like the snow itself, calm but sure. Inside, the fire crackled softly. The farmhouse smelled of pine and cinnamon. Sophie had started baking again, a habit she'd forgotten she loved. There was music playing faintly from the radio, old songs, warm and worn like a favorite sweater. When she looked around, she saw traces of their work everywhere. Her sketches framed on the walls, his old hammer hanging by the door. Two lives that had quietly intertwined, not through declarations, but through shared moments. That afternoon, townsfolk arrived with decorations for the annual winter gathering. It had been Robert's idea to host it at the farmhouse. Sophie had protested at first, but he insisted. This place was rebuilt by the town, he said. It should be celebrated by them too. So she agreed. By evening, the house was alive with voices, laughter, and music. Candles flickered on tables, and the windows glowed gold against the snowy night. Children ran through the hallways, their giggles echoing. The walls that had once held silence now carried life. Sophie found herself standing by the fire, a cup of cider in her hand, watching it all unfold. A sense of contentment settled deep in her chest. She caught Robert's eye from across the room. He was helping Mrs. Hargrove arrange gifts by the window. He smiled at her, a small, knowing smile that said more than words ever could. She smiled back, but amidst the laughter and the warmth, a shadow lingered at the edge of the evening. As the music shifted and guests began to leave, Sophie stepped outside for air. The snow had thickened, falling in lazy spirals. She pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders and walked toward the fence line, her boots crunching softly in the snow. That's when she heard it, the faint sound of footsteps behind her. She turned, startled, and her breath caught. Jack stood there, half shivering, his coat dusted with snow, his eyes tired but searching. "You again," she said quietly, her voice flat. "I wasn't sure you'd still be here," he said, stepping closer. "I didn't come to start anything. I just needed to see you one last time." Sophie looked at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. "You shouldn't have come." "I know," he said, "but I couldn't stop thinking about you, about everything I ruined." "You didn't ruin me," she replied calmly. "You just opened my eyes." He swallowed hard, his breath visible in the cold. "I heard you're happy here, that you found someone." She didn't answer right away. "I found peace," she said simply. "That's more than I ever had with you." He nodded slowly, his eyes glistening. "You look different," he murmured. "Stronger." "I am." Her voice didn't tremble. "Because I stopped waiting for someone to save me." Robert appeared in the doorway then, his figure outlined by the warm glow behind him. "Everything okay?" he asked, his tone calm but protective. Sophie turned to him and smiled faintly. "Yes, everything's fine." Jack looked between them, realization dawning, but he didn't speak. Instead, he gave a small, almost grateful nod. "You deserve this," he said softly. "Both of you." Then, without waiting for a response, he turned and walked away, his silhouette fading into the white haze of snow. Sophie watched him go, her heart steady. She wasn't angry anymore, nor sad. What she felt was something cleaner, release. The kind that comes when the past finally stops knocking. She turned back toward the farmhouse. Robert was still standing there, watching her. "You didn't have to come out," she said. "I know," he replied. "But I wanted to." He stepped closer, brushing a bit of snow from her hair. "You okay?" "Yeah," she said, her smile small but sure. "For the first time, I really am." They went back inside. The fire burned low, and the last of the guests had gone. The house was quiet again, the kind of quiet that held peace instead of emptiness. Sophie curled up on the couch, watching the flames dance. Robert sat across from her, his hands wrapped around a mug. "Funny," he said after a while, "how life circles back. The house, the town, us, all rebuilt from what was left. Maybe that's what we're meant to do," she said softly. "Not start over, just continue." He nodded, eyes thoughtful. "You know, when you showed up here, I thought you'd leave in a week." "I thought so too," she admitted, laughing quietly. "Guess we were both wrong." Outside, the snow kept falling, blanketing the world in silence. Sophie felt the warmth of the fire on her skin and the deeper warmth of knowing she had chosen this. Every scar, every step, every new beginning. She wasn't the woman who'd waited at a wedding that wasn't hers. She wasn't the one who'd run from heartbreak. She was someone new, someone who had rebuilt, brick by brick, without losing her softness. Robert stood, stretching, then offered his hand. "Come on," he said. "You'll fall asleep here." She took it, letting him pull her to her feet. "Bossy," she teased. "Efficient," he corrected. She followed him to the window, and they stood there together, watching the snow drift lazily through the night. For a long time, neither spoke. The silence between them was full, not empty. Finally, she whispered, "It's beautiful, isn't it?" "Yeah," he said quietly. "It is." And as the fire crackled behind them and the snow kept falling, Sophie realized she had stopped looking backward entirely. The past had become a story, a closed chapter, no longer a wound. What stretched before her now wasn't certainty, but it was hers. Her life, her peace, her second chance. The snow stayed for days, blanketing Meadow Ridge in silence. By the third morning, the town moved slower, wrapped in the soft hush of winter. Smoke rose lazily from chimneys, and the air smelled faintly of pine and burning wood. Sophie woke to that quiet again, her world cocooned in white and warmth. The farmhouse was still and calm. Robert had gone early to town to check on supplies, leaving a note by the coffee pot that simply read, "Back soon. Don't burn breakfast this time." She smiled when she saw it, shaking her head. His handwriting was messy but familiar, and there was comfort in that small domestic detail. She poured herself coffee and stood by the window, watching light spill across the snow-covered fields. Everything looked untouched, pure new. For once, she didn't feel like an outsider in her own life. She belonged to this place, and it belonged to her. As she moved about the house, tidying, she found herself humming. It surprised her. She hadn't realized she'd started doing that again. The radio on the counter played softly, an old tune drifting through the air, one her mother used to love. For a fleeting second, memories came flooding back, the city skyline, the noise, the version of herself who thought success meant being seen. She felt an ache for that girl, but not regret, just tenderness. She'd been lost, yes, but she'd also been brave enough to leave. That counted for something. A knock came at the door. She frowned, glancing toward it, expecting Robert. But when she opened it, it wasn't him. It was Angel, one of the women from town she'd grown close to. Angel's cheeks were flushed red from the cold, her breath visible in short bursts. "Morning, Sophie," she said, smiling. "Morning. Come in, you'll freeze." Angel stepped inside, stamping snow from her boots. "I didn't mean to intrude. Well, the town council's planning something, and we were wondering if you'd help." "With what?" Sophie asked. "The Spring Renewal Festival," Angel said brightly. "It's months away, but we're starting early this year. Robert mentioned you might have ideas for the decorations, maybe the layout." Sophie blinked. "He said that." Angel nodded. "He talks about you a lot, you know." Sophie felt her face warm slightly. "Does he now?" Angel grinned. "Only good things. Don't worry." They talked for a while, about plans, sketches, colors, themes. Sophie took notes absently, her mind half on the conversation, half somewhere else. When Angel left, the farmhouse fell back into its gentle rhythm. But Sophie couldn't shake one thought. Robert had spoken about her like she was part of the town's future, not just a visitor passing through. The idea both comforted and scared her, because staying meant choosing something permanent, and permanence had always been the hardest thing for her to trust. By afternoon, Robert returned, his boots covered in slush, cheeks pink from the cold. "Hey," he greeted, shutting the door behind him. "You've been busy." Angel stopped by, she said, watching him remove his gloves. "She told me about the festival." "Ah," he said with a grin, "so I've been exposed. You've been talking about me." "Guilty." He shrugged, unbothered. "You're good at what you do. Why wouldn't I?" She arched a brow. "You're terrible at lying." "Not lying," he said, "just stating facts." She laughed softly, shaking her head. They spent the rest of the day going through her sketches for the festival. Layouts, floral designs, color palettes. The farmhouse table was covered in papers, and at some point, they stopped working and started talking. About everything. His childhood, her dreams, the things they both lost, the things they still hoped to find. Time slipped past unnoticed until the sun dipped low, painting the snow outside in rose and amber. At one point, she looked up from her drawing and caught him watching her again, steady, curious, unguarded. "What?" she asked softly. "Nothing," he said, a smile tugging at his lips. "Just thinking how much you've changed this place. Meadowridge, my life." The words were simple, unpolished, but they landed somewhere deep. Sophie's hand stilled, her heart skipping before she forced herself to look away. "You give me too much credit," she said. "Maybe not enough." That night, after dinner, they sat by the fire. The storm had eased, but the wind still whispered through the trees. Robert handed her a book, an old novel with a cracked spine. "I found it at the market," he said. "Thought you might like it." She turned it over in her hands, smiling at the faded cover. "You remember my favorite author." "I listen," he said simply. She looked at him, then really looked. The firelight caught the lines of his face, the easy warmth in his eyes. She realized how rare it was to be seen so completely without having to perform for it. The fire popped softly. "Do you ever think," she began slowly, "that we were meant to meet?" Robert's gaze held hers. "I think we were meant to save something," he said. "Whether it was the town, this house, or ourselves, I don't know. But I think it brought us together for a reason." "You believe in fate?" "Not exactly. I believe in timing." Sophie leaned back, her heart unsteady but not afraid. "I used to think timing was what ruined me," she said quietly. "Now I think it's what rebuilt me." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It pulsed with quiet understanding, the kind that didn't need words. When she finally spoke again, her voice was barely a whisper. "You make it sound so simple." "Maybe it is," he said, his tone soft. "Maybe we just complicate it." The clock ticked. The snow continued to fall. Somewhere between laughter and stillness, Sophie realized that life had become gentle again. Not perfect, not without scars, but gentle. And for her, that was everything. Later that night, after Robert had gone to bed, Sophie lingered by the window. The moonlight spilled over the fields, silver and soft. She thought of the woman she used to be, the one who waited in silk dresses for a love that never stayed. And she thought of the woman she'd become, the one who built her peace with bare hands and steady breath. She smiled to herself, whispering into the quiet, "I almost married the wrong man, but maybe that was what led me home." And for the first time, the word home didn't mean a place. It meant a feeling, a calm, certain, unshakable knowing that she was exactly where she was meant to be. Morning came slow and golden, spilling light through the thin curtains of Sophie's bedroom. She stretched, half asleep, listening to the soft creaks of the old farmhouse warming with the sun. Downstairs, Robert was already awake. She could hear him humming faintly, his boots scraping against the wood floor. It had become their rhythm. He'd start the day before her, making coffee, checking the fields, and she'd follow with quiet grace, moving through the house like a melody that belonged there. She dressed, pulling her hair into a loose braid, the air crisp against her skin. It felt like any other morning, but something inside her whispered that change was near, hovering at the edges of her peace. When she came downstairs, Robert was by the stove, frying eggs. He looked up and smiled. "You're finally awake, sleepyhead." "It's not even 8, she said, yawning as she reached for a mug. "I'd say that's respectable." "Respectable maybe," he teased, "but lazy by farm standards." She rolled her eyes, pouring herself coffee. "Then I guess I'll never be a real farmer." "Good thing you're already good at being you," he said lightly, sliding a plate her way. It was a simple breakfast, yet it tasted like comfort. She ate slowly, the quiet between them easy, familiar. After breakfast, they drove into town for the first time in weeks. The roads were clear now, though patches of snow lingered on the shoulders. Sophie watched the scenery pass, the fields, the frozen river, the wooden bridge they always crossed. Meadow Ridge looked different in daylight, softer somehow. People waved when they saw their truck, and Robert waved back at each one. She realized then that he belonged to this town in a way she never had anywhere. And that thought brought both warmth and worry, because she wanted to belong too, but belonging meant staying, and staying meant trust. At the general store, they picked up supplies, paint, ribbons, seed packets for spring. Sophie found herself lingering by the fabric section, fingers brushing over bolts of linen and cotton. She imagined sewing tablecloths for the festival, maybe even curtains for the farmhouse. When she looked up, she caught Robert watching her again, that same patient, unspoken expression. "What?" she asked. "You look like you're planning something," he said. "Maybe I am. Should I be worried?" "Probably," she said, smiling faintly. On their way out, a voice called from behind them. "Robert Wells." Sophie turned and froze. Standing at the doorway was a woman she'd never seen before. Tall, elegant, with auburn hair tucked under a wool hat. Her eyes were sharp, the kind that scanned and measured everything at once. Robert stiffened slightly before turning. "Clara," he said quietly. The woman smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "It's been a while." The moment stretched, thin and cold. Sophie felt her pulse quicken. The name struck something distant in her memory. One of the letters she'd once found hidden in a drawer, long ago, signed with A.C. Clara. "Didn't think I'd see you here," Robert said after a beat, his tone polite but cautious. "I heard you were still in Denver." "Was," Clara replied, her gaze flicking briefly towards Sophie before returning to him. "But I'm back now. The city wasn't for me." She smiled again, this time slower. "Seems we both prefer quiet places after all." Sophie stood still, the world narrowing around her. The way Clara said we felt deliberate, like a thread pulled too tightly. Robert cleared his throat. "This is Sophie," he said, turning slightly toward her. She's helping with the Spring Renewal Festival." "Helping," Clara repeated, her voice smooth. "Of course." She extended a hand. "Nice to meet you, Sophie." Her handshake was cool, precise. "You too," Sophie said, forcing a polite smile. They talked briefly, mostly Clara and Robert, the conversation dipping into the kind of familiarity that comes from shared history. Sophie watched silently, each word weighing more than it should. When they finally left the store, Robert's shoulders were tense. Neither spoke until they reached the truck. "Old friend?" Sophie asked quietly once they were inside. "Something like that," he said, eyes on the road. She waited, but he didn't elaborate. And for the first time in months, the silence between them felt heavy. That night, the farmhouse didn't feel quite as warm. Robert was distant, distracted. He spent most of the evening in the barn, claiming he had repairs to finish. Sophie tried to read, but her eyes couldn't focus. Every sound, the wind, the ticking clock, the soft creak of the floor, seemed to echo her thoughts. When he finally came inside, she was sitting by the fire, staring at the flames. "She was the woman from before," Sophie said quietly when he walked in. "Wasn't she?" Robert stopped. For a moment, he didn't move. Then he sighed. "Yes, the one you couldn't forget." He hesitated again, then nodded once. "We were engaged," he said softly. "A long time ago, before everything fell apart." Sophie looked at him, heart sinking. "And now she's back." "Apparently," he said. "But it doesn't mean anything." "Are you sure?" she asked. "Because it felt like something." Robert sat down across from her, leaning forward. "Sophie, whatever Clara and I had, it ended for a reason. I'm not going back to that." "Then why couldn't you look at me when she spoke to you?" she asked, voice low but steady. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. The silence that followed was louder than shouting. Finally, Sophie stood. "I think I'll turn in early," she said. Her voice was calm, but her chest ached. Upstairs, she sat on her bed in the dark, listening to the faint sound of wind against the windows. She didn't cry. She didn't even move. She just sat there, feeling the edges of her peace tremble. Outside, the night deepened. Downstairs, Robert sat alone by the dying fire, running a hand through his hair, staring into the flames. He didn't know how to fix what he'd just broken, not with words, not with promises. Some things, he realized, needed to be proven in silence. And upstairs, Sophie finally whispered into the dark, her voice trembling but certain, "I can't lose myself again. Not for anyone, not even him." The house listened, still and knowing. Change had arrived again, quiet but unyielding. The days that followed were heavy with unsaid things. The easy laughter that once filled the farmhouse was gone, replaced by quiet gestures that barely bridged the silence. Sophie busied herself with plans for the spring renewal festival. Her sketches spread across the kitchen table, ribbons and notes scattered like fragments of control. Robert kept his distance, working long hours outside, fixing fences that didn't need fixing, tending to the soil though it was still too cold to plant. They moved around each other like ghosts in a shared dream, speaking only when necessary, pretending everything was fine. But Sophie could feel it in the way his eyes lingered too long on nothing, the way he'd start to speak and stop halfway, as if words had turned fragile in his mouth. One afternoon, she walked into town alone. The air was sharp, the sun glinting off melting snow. Meadow Ridge felt alive again, children laughing near the bakery, old men chatting outside the hardware store. Yet Sophie felt separate from it all, an observer in someone else's story. She stopped by the bookstore, her safe place, and browsed through rows of forgotten novels until she found an old poetry collection. On the first page, in faded ink, someone had written, "To love is to risk being seen." She closed the book slowly. Those words stayed with her as she left, echoing in rhythm with her steps. As she turned a corner near the post office, she saw Robert. He wasn't alone. Clara stood beside him, her red hair bright against the pale afternoon. They were talking, nothing intimate, just words, but Clara's hand brushed his sleeve, and Sophie's heart tightened all the same. She didn't turn back, didn't speak. She simply kept walking until her breath became uneven and the sound of her boots against the ground drowned everything else. That evening, Robert returned late. The house was dark except for a single lamp by the fireplace. Sophie sat near it, reading the poetry book, her face unreadable. "You were in town," she said without looking up. "Yeah," he replied, hesitant. "I ran into Clara. I saw." Silence. "It wasn't what it looked like," he said, stepping closer. "It never is," she whispered. He ran a hand through his hair, frustrated. "Sophie, please. You have to believe me." "Believe what?" she asked, finally meeting his eyes. "That the woman you once loved just happened to show up, and you're completely unaffected? It's not that simple." "It never is," she repeated, her voice sharper this time. "But I need simple, Robert. I've had enough of complicated." He took a deep breath, searching for words that wouldn't sound like excuses. "I didn't ask for her to come back," he said quietly. "I didn't even know she was here until that day. Whatever she's trying to find, it's not me anymore." "Then what are you trying to find?" Sophie asked. "Because I'm standing right here, trying to understand where I fit into all this." Her voice cracked on the last word. Robert reached for her, but she stepped back. "Don't," she said softly. "Not until you know what you want." He froze, the distance between them suddenly vast. That night, sleep wouldn't come. Sophie lay awake, staring at the ceiling, her mind caught between reason and ache. Every part of her wanted to believe him, but fear whispered louder. She'd been here before, believing, hoping, losing. She couldn't do it again. When morning came, she packed a small bag, not to leave for good, but to think, to breathe, to remember herself outside of him. She left a note on the kitchen table. "Need space. Don't follow." Then she walked out into the cold, the horizon stretching wide and unfamiliar. Robert found the note hours later. His chest tightened as he read it, the words sinking like stones. He wanted to go after her, to explain, but something stopped him. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was the memory of her saying, "Not until you know what you want." He sat down at the table, staring at her handwriting until the ink blurred in his vision. Meanwhile, Sophie checked into a small inn on the edge of town. The owner, a kind older woman named Mrs. Gale, gave her a room overlooking the river. It was quiet, peaceful, the kind of place that asked for reflection. She spent her days walking along the riverbank, sketching, thinking. At night, she'd sit by the window, watching the moon's reflection tremble on the water. Slowly, she began to remember who she was before all the noise, before heartbreak, before expectations. A few days later, there was a soft knock on her door. When she opened it, she didn't find Robert. She found Clara. "May I come in?" Clara asked, her tone unexpectedly gentle. Sophie hesitated, then stepped aside. Clara entered, her coat still dusted with snow. "You don't know me," she began. but I think I owe you something. I doubt that, Sophie said quietly. Clara smiled faintly. You're wrong. I came back to see Robert because I thought I still loved him. I thought maybe time had just confused me. But when I saw you two together, I realized something. He's not mine anymore. Sophie studied her, unsure what to say. Clara continued. He talks about you the way he used to talk about music. Like it's something he doesn't deserve, but can't live without. I think that's love. Real love. There was no bitterness in her voice, just calm acceptance. He's scared, Clara added softly. You both are. But I've learned that fear doesn't protect you. It just delays happiness. When Clara left, Sophie sat for a long time, staring out at the river again. The world looked different somehow. Softer. The next morning, she packed her bag and walked back to the farmhouse. The door was unlocked, the fire still cold. Robert was outside, splitting wood. When he saw her, the axe slipped from his hand. Sophie, she took a slow breath. I needed to find my peace, she said. Did you? I think so. But peace doesn't mean running forever. She stepped closer. You hurt me, but I also know what it feels like to lose something that could matter. Robert's throat tightened. I don't want to lose you. Then don't, she said simply. Just be honest. Always. He nodded, words failing him, eyes saying everything instead. The wind stirred between them, cold but cleansing. And for the first time, Sophie didn't feel like she was standing on the edge of heartbreak. She was standing on the edge of truth. Spring came quietly to Meadow Ridge. The snow melted into the soil, rivers unthawed, and the hills began to blush with color again. The air was soft now, alive with the smell of rain and wildflowers. Sophie woke to birdsong instead of wind, sunlight spilling through her window in gentle strokes. It had been weeks since the day she'd returned to the farmhouse. Weeks since the silence between her and Robert had begun to shift from fragile to whole. The distance that once felt impossible was gone, replaced by a steady rhythm of forgiveness, slow but real. Some mornings, they barely spoke. Some nights, they talked until the stars dimmed. There were no grand apologies, no dramatic confessions, just small, consistent acts that rebuilt what had almost been lost. The Spring Renewal Festival was only a day away. Sophie stood outside the barn, overseeing the final touches, string lights, floral garlands, and wooden stalls decorated with handmade crafts. The townspeople moved about, laughing, painting, setting up tables. Angel was nearby, fussing over the dessert table. You've outdone yourself this time, Sophie, she said, arranging jars of honey. This is the prettiest this town's ever looked. It's not just me, Sophie replied, smiling. Everyone came together. Still, Angel said, leaning closer, you've brought something back to this place. It's like Meadow Ridge remembered how to breathe. Sophie didn't know how to answer that, so she just smiled again, brushing her hands over her apron. The truth was, she'd changed too. The woman who had arrived in this town months ago had been running, from heartbreak, from failure, from herself. But somewhere between the quiet mornings, the laughter shared over coffee, and the stillness of the fields, she had found something better than escape. She had found peace that didn't depend on perfection. By late afternoon, the festival grounds were ready. The air buzzed with anticipation, music drifting through the open fields. Children chased each other between stalls, couples danced, and laughter echoed off the barn walls. Sophie moved among the crowd, greeting people, checking details, making sure everything ran smoothly. When she finally stopped to catch her breath, she saw Robert across the field, talking with Angel's husband. For a moment, she simply watched him. The way he laughed, the way his presence seemed to steady everything around him. And when his eyes found hers, he smiled. Not the hesitant, uncertain smile of months ago, but one full of quiet knowing. As the sun dipped low, painting the sky in streaks of amber and rose, the music softened. Robert walked toward her, his hands in his pockets, the crowd blurring behind him. You did it, he said, his voice carrying a hint of awe. We did it, she corrected. No, he said, stepping closer, this was you. You gave this town life again. She looked up at him, her heart calm but full. You once told me timing matters, she said. Maybe this was it. Our time. Maybe it always was, he replied. They stood there for a long while, saying nothing more. Around them, lanterns began to glow, hanging from branches like stars fallen to earth. The laughter, the music, the scent of blooming lilac, all of it seemed to weave together into a moment that felt almost unreal. Sophie closed her eyes briefly, letting it sink in, the warmth, the peace, the simple miracle of being right where she was. Later that night, when the festival had ended and the town had gone quiet, Sophie and Robert walked back to the farmhouse under a silver sky. The fields shimmered faintly in the moonlight, and somewhere in the distance, an owl called softly. Inside, the fire was still burning low. Sophie poured them both tea, and they sat by the window in silence, watching the flicker of light dance across the floor. "Do you ever think about how different things could have been?" she asked after a while. "Sometimes," he said, "but I think if we hadn't broken, we wouldn't have learned how to bend." She smiled at that, tracing the rim of her cup with her finger. "I used to think heartbreak was the worst thing that could happen," she murmured. "Now I think it's what taught me to love better." Robert reached for her hand, not as a promise, but as something steady, real. "We don't need perfect," he said softly. "Just true." Outside, the first drops of rain began to fall, light cleansing alive. Sophie looked out at the night and felt something unfurl inside her, something like freedom. She wasn't waiting anymore. Not for approval, not for certainty, not even for love to fix her. She had already done the hardest thing. She had stayed when it mattered. When she turned back to Robert, he was watching her the way he always did, like she was a story he didn't want to end. And for the first time in her life, Sophie didn't fear endings. Because this wasn't one. It was simply the quiet beginning of something real. Weeks later, as spring deepened into warmth, Sophie walked down to the river alone. The world was awake with color, green hills, golden grass, wildflowers nodding in the breeze. She stood at the edge of the water and smiled, thinking of everything that had led her here. Heartbreak, hope, courage, loss, and love, all of it tangled together into a single truth. Every ending she once mourned had simply been a doorway. She knelt, picked up a small stone, and tossed it into the river. Ripples spread wide, catching sunlight in their circles. "Thank you," she whispered, not to anyone in particular, but to life itself, for breaking her open, for teaching her to rebuild, for reminding her that sometimes being almost chosen leads you exactly where you're meant to be. Behind her, she heard footsteps. When she turned, Robert stood a few feet away, hands in his pockets, watching her with a soft smile. "You didn't tell me you were leaving the house this early," he said. "Couldn't sleep," she replied. "The river called. Did it say what it wanted?" "Just to remind me it's still moving," she said, her voice light. "Like us." He stepped beside her, their shoulders brushing. "Then I guess we keep moving too." The sun rose higher, gilding the world in gold. Sophie looked out over the river, feeling the warmth on her face, and for the first time in a long, long time, she felt whole. Not because someone loved her, but because she'd learned how to love herself through everything. And in that stillness, in that peace, she finally understood. She hadn't been the woman left behind. She was the woman who stayed long enough to find herself again.